All right, welcome back to the Title Block Live, a special presentation of the Title Block podcast, a show about Canadian theatre designers, their history, and their craft. I am your host, Michael Cruz, coming to you from Cataraqui, or Kingston, land of the Huron-Wendat, Algonquin, Mississauga, and Haudenosaunee people. Tonight, we present what will prove to be another important and fascinating discussion about grounding Indigenous art and design on mixed-race teams, a conversation reflecting on creating spaces and processes for Indigenous theatre with anti-appropriative practices and internation collaborations. This is another co-pro with the Associated Designers of Canada, who are generously providing a bit of funding for the moderators and the panelists. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel below at the button below. You know, English is hard. And please visit titleblock.com for more extensive bios and listen to all the episodes from the Title Block podcast. Let me introduce tonight's panel. Yolanda Bonnell, she, her, is a queer, two-spirit, Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, and South Asian performer, playwright, and poet from Fort William First Nation in Thunder Bay, Ontario. Now based in Takaranto, Yolanda's Dora-nominated solo show, Bug, appeared at Theatre Passe Muraille in February 2020, co-presented by Manadoons Collective, which she runs with Michif or Métis artist Cole Elvis. Yolanda, welcome to the Title Block Live.
Miigwech, Ani, Bojo, Yolanda Nindishnakas, Kishiba Mayanka Nindigo Jipwemang, Makwanindodam, Fort William First Nation Donjaba, Doninda. I speak my language. Somebody once said that we speak our language because it makes our ancestors happy. And so whenever I introduce myself, I try to introduce myself in Anishinaabe because it wasn't taught to me. So that's how I introduce myself now. So miigwech for having me.
Thank you. Mishelle Cuttler is a sound designer and a composer based in Vancouver who works primarily at the intersection of music and storytelling. She is a board member for the ADC and a core member of the Vancouver Design Forum. Mishelle Cuttler, welcome to the Title Block Live.
Hello, thanks for having me. So happy to be here.
Excellent. Samantha McCue is an Anishinaabe, Bekwai, and Neduden costume designer and anti-racism advocate based in Ottawa, Ontario. You can find more information about her at her website at sammcquedesign.com. Samantha, welcome to the Title Block Live.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And Emily Soussana is a projection, set, and lighting designer based out of Jajajay or Montreal. They are the co-founder of Potato Cakes Digital, a production design and digital arts collective whose mandate orbits around the integration of technology into traditional art forms and the exploration of how visual art can help facilitate the telling of a story. Emily, welcome back to the Title Block Live.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
And finally, our host for this evening, Kim Senklip Harvey, is a proud Silicatine, Tanaka, and Dakel woman who is is a fire creator, Indigenous theorist, and cultural evolutionist. She completed the BFA program at UBC and is currently doing her master's in creative writing at UVic. Kim is interested in Indigenous creation works, dismantling and troubling colonial and neo-capitalistic systems, with a particular focus on the resurgence of Indigenous matriarchal-led systems and frameworks, especially those amplifying the emancipatory journeys of those enduring state oppression. She's also really good at buck hunter, like really good. She is also the moderator of tonight's panel. Kim, welcome to the Title Block Live.
Why, Hulita, my name's Kim. I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you so much, Michael and Mishelle, for having us. I just want to honor all the traditional territories that we're on right now, all the artists who kind of came before us, who allowed us to be here and hold this space. Mishelle, I just want to honor all the work that you do with ADC, the advocacy work and the championing that you do. You really embody the fact that this kind of advocacy work is not something you do at the latter part of your career. It's not something you do after you've endured all the challenges. You're really taking this head on and really was pivotal to creating this space as we engaged and endured our own frustrations as people working in collaborative practices. I'm And I do want to take a little bit of time to let each person introduce themselves, because what I want this panel to also be is like an embodied learning and practice. So we're not just talking about the work, we're actually embodying the creative practice as we go. And a big part of working with internations, working within mixed race, is something that we called, and Dr. Lindsay Lachance studied and illuminated and offered to us, is this notion of presencing, meeting the present moment with our ancestors, with all organisms, with our histories, with the future generations, and presencing our diasporic journeys to get to this moment allows us to bear witness to each person in a way that we might not be able to. It also gives a space for us to arrive here in this moment. I think sometimes when we, particularly because I can only say, and I'll preface the whole conversation with this first, we are speaking from our experiences as Indigenous nation specific and non-Indigenous creators. We do not speak for all of Indigenous theater. We don't speak for all collaborative practice. That's an impossible feat and task we would never take on. We've assembled today to share our experiences, and that's really what they are. Do not go into a rehearsal hall and say, well, Kim Senklip, Harvey said, oh my gosh, Yolanda Bonnell told us, Sam McCue, said we have to, please don't misunderstand this space holding for that. But one of the things that I tend to find when Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups are getting together, one, and I've said it before, white folks want to jump in real quick. They want to get right to the work. Within an hour, we've eaten donuts, and then we're going to read the script, and we're going to start blocking the show. And in an hour, day 2 by the morning, we're going to go back, and everyone should be off book. And I should know everything about you except anything about you. And for Indigenous people, that's very uncomfortable, I find. The artists that I've worked with and tried to create space are like, I always like, whoa, who's your grandma? And so this active presencing, this active introduction is actually something I'm still challenged by every time it happens, because a part of it for me is meeting people where they are right now. A part of it for me as an artistic leader is to not know and just assume Yolanda is a good friend of mine, so I know exactly where she's at. It's my job as an artistic leader and practitioner to hold the space for Yolanda and Emily and all parts of the team to go, where are they right now in this moment? It would be very strange if we walked into rehearsal hall right now and didn't talk about the Black Rebellion. It'd be very strange to go into the rehearsal hall right now and not talk about the BIPOC challenges that we're enduring right now. And a part of presencing, I take it on as an act to say, okay, let me breathe, let me get to this moment, let me hear what pieces of their cultural heritage they're gifting me in this moment, and how can I respond accurately, like right here and now. So I want to go around and let this group, because we've all worked together and I love you all dearly, and so I hope we can keep that intimate feeling. But I want to hear where all of you are at. It's been a while since some of us have seen each other, and a lot has occurred. And this is a complex topic that we're talking about, that we're all in the midst of navigating. And I said in the email this morning, Dr. Adrienne Keene, who, if you haven't checked out her site, Native Appropriations, she runs a blog, talks about the fact that being a good feminist is thinking out loud. And a big part of this conversation is us thinking out loud, falling on our faces, making offers, going into investigations, reflecting, coming back to a practice. So we're going to be good feminists and good practitioners by thinking out loud today. But Yo-Yo, maybe we'll go to you, and then Sam, and then Mishelle and Emily, and just how you doing, where you're from, who's your grandma?
Miigwech, Kim, and miigwech for having me and for bringing this practice forward. I also try to hold space in the same way, because I think it is also very important. So as I said earlier, I'm on Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, and so I am in Diggerondo, which is the Mohawk pronunciation for Toronto. And I always think about how my ancestors moved through this space when I think about the Anishinaabe migration story, which is like the 7 Fires prophecy. And so that my ancestors moved through the St. Lawrence River and up and around, and some settled in Manitoulin and then moved up towards northwestern Ontario, which is where my family settled. Yeah, so I think about that a lot when I'm here, like as I'm here on this land, about that how embodied this land is and who's come through here. So um, about the who's your grandma question, I actually have been talking to my cousins a lot lately from the res, and
Ooh, cousin.
Yeah.
During the pandemic.
My cousin Helen is living on the res and is like recently just started, or not recently, she's been doing it for a while, but has been working with birch bark a lot. And so she's been making like earrings and t-shirts and all kinds of things with her designs on them. And so there's this really beautiful work of sovereign work and self-governance work that's happening on my reserve. And I think it's really a beautiful thing. And so we've been talking a lot, and we've been recently talking about our great grandmother, my grandma Helen Bannon, who I found out did a lot of beadwork and was also a storyteller. And I remember her. She passed away when I was probably about 4 years old. So I actually do have vivid memories of her and sitting on her lap and her telling me stories. And so I like to think that a lot of my weaving abilities come from her. That there's sort of like that spiritual or ability through bloodline that kind of comes down when I think about her. So there's something really nice about thinking about my grandma's line.
And you've been beading. Like I got gifted this gorgeous, stunning piece. Like when we talk about work being relational, Yo-Yo just threw in some mail this stunning piece. Like it was beautiful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, it's been the night that the fire started in Minneapolis after George Floyd was killed. I sat down and needed to get my emotions out somehow, and beading was the first way I was able to do it. And the first piece I beaded, I sent to a friend of mine, Emma Jade, and it was just full of fire. And so like I've been beading these pieces for people randomly and just sending them out because I've been needing to get it out of me. So I'm trying to put a lot of love and emotion into each. And somebody said too, they're like, our beadwork, all of our beading, like earrings, everything, it's not a product, that it's all art. Every single piece of beadwork that an Indigenous person makes is an art piece. It's not just a product to be sold, there's something special that goes into it. So I really took that to heart, and I didn't think about that until halfway through all of my work, and I was like, oh, look at that, I'm doing another art form, and I didn't even realize it. Which I didn't learn how to bead until we were doing Kamloopa, and Juanita in Saskatoon invited us all to her house and taught us how to bead, and that's where I learned how to bead. And then everything else after that was self-taught.
Oh,
it's beautiful. Matriarchs, big ups to our matriarchs, man.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Yo-Yo. Sam McCue, so good to see you, babe.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. It's so good to see everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Sam. My traditional name is Niganganawabikwe, which means woman who looks ahead in Anishinaabe, Anishinaabemowin. I don't speak my language. Unfortunately, my dad is in the process of learning the language, and I haven't reached that point yet, but I'm certainly looking forward to getting to that point. I am Anishinaabekwe and Neduden, which is from Neduden territories in northern BC. And I was raised in Vancouver on Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Salish territories. And I was in Vancouver until I moved away for university. So, when I introduce myself, I will acknowledge, my blood heritage, but also, the cultures and the land that kind of influenced my my growing up and how I was raised. So that's kind of where I come from and what I bring into my research and my history and my space. Yeah, I'm currently in Ottawa, which is always.
That's Emily. Emily, what are you doing? Like
There's a band on the street
Oh.
that's like a marching band. I can't control them. They're just there.
Now you're watching something on YouTube.
I know.
No,
Like, what
they're
is she
just
doing?
like-
Wheel of Fortune?
I was like looking to see if my like border was lighting up at all, which usually lets you know that sound is going through. That's also what the shifty eyes have been. Is
Okay. You have the soundtrack. That's fine.
I'll mute for now. Hopefully they'll meander to some other street.
Okay, Sam. Sorry.
Oh my goodness. No worries. It's not every day you get a marching band. So yeah, anyway, that's, who I am, where I come from. My grandma is, on my mom's side, is a residential school survivor. And she's a language speaker and also a very talented beater, speaking of beating. And my grandmother on my dad's side is Scottish and German settler heritage. And yeah, and I'm really loving the beating conversation because my great grandmother on my dad's side was also a very talented beater. So I've got beaters on both sides, but I was teaching myself at the beginning of the pandemic when I was like, I need things to do. Yeah. So I've been diving into that practice as well, which is really interesting.
So good.
And Sam was the costume designer on Kamloopa, and blew my mind and my spirit away. And it's speaking of like matriarchs intersecting. I remember when your mom came to the show, Sam. I don't know if she told you this, but I was like backstage, and then I came back out, and she was like, "I'm Sam's mom," and I gave her like the big hug, and I was like, "Your daughter," like. Just so proud, like proud mama, all around proud matriarch. And also it was just such an honor that continued to be the joy that matriarchs came out after that show. And I remember Gina Yacht, Caitlin's mom, loved Gina, was so excited about everything, but meeting your mom was really such an honor. So thank you for introducing yourself and presenting all of that knowledge. Like just thinking about the fact that, beaters on both your sides and how land intersects with your work and how you really think about that trajectory when it comes to design. These, presencing and landing into the work is, for me as a leader, trying to think about, okay, how can I best hold space for you? And that was really beautiful. So thanks for being so generous with us, Sam. Cuttler, Mishelle Cuttler.
Hey, yeah, I'm Mishelle. I do sound and music stuff. I grew up here on Coast Salish territory, and like, boy, have I never been as grateful to be on this land as I have over the last few months, with everything going on in the pandemic and the amount of time I've spent in these parks and with these trees, and when there's nothing else we can do but be outside in the land, like it's a really new level of appreciation for this place. I am Jewish. My ancestors all come from Eastern Europe by way of Montreal, and then my parents came out here. And right now, where I'm at right now is I've just had some really, I've had the pleasure and joy of playing some music in some public spaces with some great friends, which has been wonderful. And also realizing that I don't think I was prepared for the level of stress that going back into this work is going to put on us now as we go in with this awareness and caution of the pandemic and what that means for our mental health. It was so much harder than I thought it was going to be, and really great learning. And I'm continuing to figure out how to navigate that. But I think that in addition to everything else we're talking about, we have to take so much care of yourselves and each other as we go forward if we're trying to move back, because like it's just crazy. It's crazy. It's a crazy situation we're in, and we want to make the art, but it's gonna be a whole new thing. So that my head's is been around that. But in general, like Kim and I have had some really amazing conversations, and Emily, around all these things. And I feel like in the last year or two, especially, I've been starting to learn a lot about these internation collaborations and the kinds of things that us as settler artists in the context of these projects can begin to offer and learn, and how our presence is helpful and sometimes not. So I'm really excited to talk about it.
Yes. Mishelle and I worked on Skyborn, and Mishelle is also on a sound team for Break Horizons, a rocking Indigenous justice story. Thank you, Mishelle. Emily, is the marching band still here?
No, they appear to have found another street to march down. Mishelle, are you part of a marching band? Is that what you mean by outdoor music?
Well, I actually did do some roving stuff earlier on in the pandemic with some friends where we sang at people's balconies, but not with a marching band.
That's delightful.
Love it.
Hi, yeah. So I'm Emily. I was born in Ottawa, but I've lived in Montreal for the past 6-ish years now. In terms of family, on my mom's side, they're Scottish-Irish settlers who settled in Mobile, which is an area about an hour and a half away from Montreal. And then on my dad's side, my grandmother is from France and my grandfather is from Morocco, and they emigrated during World War II, or some point sort of after, like around then. They were displaced in some way that I don't unfortunately really know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm doing all right. I mean, like, it's a pandemic and there's like great social upheaval, so all right, I think, is like a relative statement. But trying to do my best to like take the time. It's like a mixture of like trying to work on like personal things and like upgrade skill sets and make art that I like want to make versus like job art. I mean, because there is no job art, so that makes that choice a little easier. And then also, trying to look at how, when theaters do reopen, we can have like more equitable, fair working conditions. So working with some of the theaters in Montreal and trying to figure out what that looks like going forwards, because like it's one of those things that's really frustrating when people are like, we need to get back to work, like get back to like the hustle, and you're like, but like it's garbage, like we work in a garbage system, why would we want to go back to that? Like, and one of those things where people are, one of the excuses that comes up a lot is like, oh well, we've programmed our space like 3 years in advance, we can't like possibly make changes. And you're like, well, you haven't programmed it now, you have nothing. So
yeah,
like now's the time to make changes. So like there's a mixture of like, I sort of go back and forth between those two things, and like also puttering away in my little balcony garden, which is a great solace in these times, because when I lived at home, we had like a big enough backyard that my mom and I could always grow things. And then when I moved away, I haven't had like time or space. And then this year, I don't really have space, but I do have time. And if time balcony engineering projects can happen, then I can have fire escape Swiss chard. So
thanks, Emily. Emily has also worked with me on Kamloopa, Skyborn, and now Potato Cake Digital with her company, and Andrew will be working on Break Horizons with the Arts Club and the Citadel. I'll keep it really brief with myself. You can find a lot of information about me online. I come from the Silcotin, Syilx, Tunaka, and Dekel nations. I also come by way of most of my patriarchal patrilineal side from Norway, the Welsh region, and Scotland. And, in these times, I think it's very important to think about those diasporic journeys. And I've been having a lot of time to work with my family to find more about our like Shohatmik, Tunaka, Syilx relations, which has been incredibly important because of the work and the characters that I'm creating with Break, but we'll get into that later. I also want to take the time to honor, because I don't want to forget this, and I think it's really important that when people are assembling international teams, I've learned the hard way that if I work with practitioners who aren't engaged citizens, who aren't active community members, who are constantly working on their knowledge, who are constantly working on their transformations and anti-racist work, the work suffers because there's a lot of education I have to do. There's a lot of imperial conditioning where people kind of just show up and think it's the same old, the same old. And if there's one thing that you kind of take away from this space making is that if the artists on this panel, Yolanda, Sam, Mishelle, and Emily, are not only powerful artists and practitioners, but activists, change makers, stakeholders within transformation in the community. These are people, matriarchs, ignited artists on the move, demanding accountability in many ways beyond just a play. And I find that with my aesthetic, with the way that I work, the pushing of these boundaries and cultural evolution that is necessary for us to create work that I find igniting, exciting, necessary, and urgent. And I really can't work with people who aren't building their capacity like this panel is here. So everybody listen up to what I have to say. You do want to add to that, Yo-Yo, about how you create your teams as well?
Yes, it's a similar thing. When Cole and I work together, like Cole Elvis is my partner in terms, we run Managing Collective together. And whenever we are thinking about teams, we have worked with primarily Indigenous designers, but we also are trying to work with like designers who are definitely on the edge of like doing that decolonial work and doing that like good, strong, safe and safe work that keeps artists safe and really thinking outside of those sort of colonial or imperial kind of boxes. And I look at like who they worked with in the past and like what kind of eye they have and how that their work supports not just the story, but the people who are telling the storytellers that are telling the story as well. And so like for anybody that we've brought in to work with us, they all kind of fall in that category. And we have good discussions with them. And if there's something that they're new, and a lot of these people I find are doing this work without even realizing it. And I think that there's a lot of people who are doing that, but don't know how to name it yet, or don't quite know what it, like where it falls, because it is so like unbelievable to have radical care within the theater industry. And so to be able to name that is I think sometimes jarring for folks. So yeah.
Thanks, Yo-Yo. And I just want to echo that again, that if you're an Indigenous young person looking to decolonize and indigenize your work, the homework, the due diligence of working with practitioners beyond their resume, beyond especially what white arts leaders or imperial leaders say, oh, they make a good show, they're a good designer. Really understand what that means for you and what you actually need with regards to that. Because for me, there are good designers everywhere. There are potent designers, but I need people who move beyond that. And I just can't afford the time, or I don't have the spiritual desire to educate people beyond that. But before we dive in, I want to talk a little bit about the concept of what is grounded practice, what is anti-appropriative practice. And I think for the sake of this conversation, because one, there are so many versions of these ideologies, so many understandings of these definitions, we'll kind of use these ones for this conversation, but please trouble it, please undermine it, call task to it, anyone on the panel, if you're like, I'm not sure about that. We all have our own, but for the sake of this conversation, I think it's really important we have a metric to say, this is the definition that we're working off of for this conversation. And I kind of drafted one up knowing I've worked with all of you and I relatively understand your values and way of working. And also, I don't think we talk about this enough. We want to have like anti-culturally appropriative practice. What's culture? What's appropriation? What's practice? What's process? I don't know what that is for a lot of artists, and it's a part of my due diligence as a producer, as a creator, to understand what that means for everyone. And that's also why I'm really vocal about the way that my position. I remember Clayton from the Electrics was like, we know why you do business, Kim. Everybody knows you're here for equity for Indigenous femmes and matriarchs. That is very clear for us. And I make that clear so that when I do start working with people, people have no excuse to not understand who it is, what I stand for, and why I do this work. But that being said, let's just talk about this for a second. What is culture? Culture for me are the constructs of the social group. They kind of compose the philosophy, the science, the mysticism, albeit the religion, the spirituality, and the governance of a social group. So all of those things kind of create a culture for a group. And when you add that together, you kind of get a heritage, just from my understanding. So when you look at a group of people, you take all of these elements and that is their culture. When you talk about appropriation, from my understanding, it is the taking and the usurping of that, appropriating it without permission or consent. So if we're going to talk about cultural appropriation, we're talking about taking cultural elements of a specific group, of this collective, without permission and without consent. And I unfortunately have to list them in a way like spirituality, mysticism, philosophy, science, indigenous intelligence, siloing them, but really they are woven into the fabric of Indigenous ontology. There wasn't art necessarily without governance. There wasn't governance without philosophy. There wasn't science without mysticism. That a way of looking at Indigenous culture is that we don't silo it off to be managed the way imperial culture does. And so when you're working with an Indigenous practitioner, you should be having these conversations. Yeah, Yo-Yo?
Yeah, I would say too, like, I don't think it's, I would say that it's not always non-consensual. I think even something that I've said is that just because one person says it's okay doesn't mean that it's okay for everyone. But often there are Indigenous people, and if we're going to speak about that, like that there are Indigenous people that be like, yeah, that's fine. Whereas it's harmful for others. Like not everybody, not one Indigenous person can speak on behalf of all Indigenous people. My sort of philosophy with that is that if it's harmful to a person, and cultural appropriation is harmful, that if it's harmful to a group of people and you've got one person that's like, yeah, go ahead, and the other person's like, actually that's harmful, maybe you shouldn't do it. Yep. So, but just to say that like consent isn't always the like marker of that.
Yeah, totally, absolutely. And consent, I say that in the mention of like culture being a group of people's collective culture. So culture, you can get culture of one person and that's their culture consent. But when we speak about a culture of a race, a culture of a nation, consent, acknowledgement, and respect has to be of that of the collective. And this is why it's so complicated, because when you go from Indigenous groups to nations, to tribes, to kin, to individual, getting consent, getting acknowledged, and getting permission might be very different for each family. It might look very different for each nation, each tribe, each clan. It's really takes a lot of due diligence and work. I would reference the way that my great grandmother Edith, my grandmother Emma, my mother spoke Sokoteen. It was different in each generation. There would be words when they were all alive. It was so fascinating to see them go, wait, what was that word? Wait, what was that? What was that thing? So that's in part cultural understanding, but also the presence of cultural evolution, that the language was changing within the generations, and getting consent on a word was really fascinating and really interesting. But I agree, Yo-Yo, just like we can't talk for everyone, you should not be like, well, Kim Harvey said it's okay, so we should do this. And then you have a whole group of people saying, hello, I'm being harmed or negatively impacted by this. I need to have a conversation. For me, one thing that I want to talk about before we jump into the first one, and we're going to come in hot, is kind of what I was just saying about cultural evolution. For me, the way that I assemble teams and the reason that I create art and artistic ceremony is for cultural evolution. That's the basis of the podcast that I have, the Indigenous Cultural Evolution. It's my responsibility as a Salish storyteller to meet the present. I think it's a tactic of white supremacy and colonialism to primordialize and put Indigenous people into a stasis of culture and ability. And for us to break ourselves free is to evolve culture, is to have agency, is to be the authorities on how we practice our ceremony, how we identify Indigenous people, and how we create our art. And that can tend to scare a lot of people. I've had traditionalists come at me and say, that's not traditional, and that's not this, that's not, you evolved this this, you move that. And it's my teachings that is actually my responsibility. That yes, we can literally bang the same drum song for 10,000 years. And we also have to have versions, dialects, auxiliary components to that practice. And for me, I'm not a traditionalist in my community. I'm not a language speaker. I do participate in ceremony. A lot of ours were oppressed, but I'm reclaiming that practice. My responsibility as an urban, displaced Indigenous Salish woman is to understand those cultural heritages and then also evolve them. I want to reference and honor Bonita Lawrence, who wrote this book that I think if you're working with Indigenous people, international collaborations to read Real Indians and Others, Mixed Blood Urban Native Peoples, and she speaks the need for us to engage with a level of marginity for us not just to survive, but thrive. And she also speaks to the notion that we as Indigenous peoples must have the authority on determining who's Indigenous. And I extend this ideology that we also have to have authority on the determination of what our culture is, which brings us to collaborators and artistic creators like Yolanda, like Sam, who are holding space to create cultural evolutions and innovations within theatrical practices. So I said, let's start really hot. Let's start in with the hot topic. What makes us uncomfortable within Western notions of creation? What still shocks us in ways? What is the practices that are not grounded? And also, you know, Sam McCue and I were having a little chat yesterday over the gram, talking about where are the responsibilities of artistic leaders and theater companies to ensure Indigenous projects, artistic ceremonies have the cultural competent staff and processes to ensure that our sacred pieces, our sacred stories, our elements of ceremony are being respected and not dismantled like other imperial pieces. So I want to throw it to Yo-Yo and then Sam, and then we'll get the white portion of the crew to talk in the intonation aspects of it. But Yo-Yo, like what frightens you? What scares you? What have you seen where you've been like, oh my gosh?
Well, so many things. What scares me is, I mean, when I think like the boiling it down to a seed is basically like the unsafety, or the not being safe, and I mean like physically, emotionally, spiritually. When I think about a lone Indigenous actor in a show, my chest gets tight. Like I immediately am like, no one's there for that person, like, because often you know, the tokenizing of BIPOC artists, when there's one of you and you come into a space, you're treated like you're tokenized, and it's through microaggressions that often people don't realize that they're doing because they don't have that lived experience. So you're in a room full of people who are not white people, who might make an off comment, you know, remark or whatever. Sorry, I live in Toronto. Who might say something that is a microaggression, and they think they're just making an offhanded comment when really it's something that cuts deep. Those little things that you say cut us really deep because we get them over and over again. Mm-hmm. What is one thing to one white person is many to a BIPOC person. And so when I think about having one BIPOC person in a play or in a situation, it scares me because I know that somebody's not going to be there for them. And so I've, you know, and even in rooms where there are, I've been in a show where there were a fair amount of BIPOC artists in the show, but there were also white people in the show. And there was, you know, we set boundaries and rules, but things happen, and then who's held accountable when those things happen? So when you're saying like, where are the arts leaders and where are the people who are like holding that, like having those spaces, like where are those people that are like keeping people safe? And physically, when like a scene goes too far, or you know, and what is a safe space for one person physically is not a safe space for another. So I think that for me, one of the biggest problems is that because white people don't have the lived experience of what it is like to be a racialized person, there's a disconnect in how those spaces are safe and or not. What they think when they are creating a space that they think is safe is often not safe, which is why I push for consultation. And when I say consultation, I don't mean like, let's have a conversation on a phone or let's have a meeting. Like, you need to have a person in there. If you are telling any part of an Indigenous story, you need to have more than one Indigenous person in that room, because you need to be held accountable for holding that space, holding that ceremony, holding that person, so that they're not being tokenized, you know. And we need to think about how those spaces are being held and who is responsible for bringing in that funding, who's responsible for ensuring that that's happening. Because I've heard too many stories and have been a part of too many stories where violence has happened or microaggressions have happened or whatnot, and then that person, we're holding it, we're carrying it in our bodies, and then we have to go and do a show.
Yeah, and with regards to design teams, has there been any instances, or where do you feel like the sector is moving in terms of having enough Indigenous designers in the room to hold that spaces? And can you maybe give an example or contextualize the danger of just having one Indigenous designer, or like creator forbid, no Indigenous designers?
I think it's the same thing. I think it runs along the similar lines of that person is still also not being safe, because if you've got an Indigenous designer, I'm sure that's often if there's a white director, the dismissal of their choices, because there's no understanding of where those choices are, what those choices are rooted in. That often those choices are rooted in a deep Indigenous way, and so like a dismissal of something can happen. I mean, I luckily for the most part, I've had some pretty good experiences in some ways, but I've definitely been a part of things where I'm like, this is uncomfortable. I'm not comfortable with this.
I'm uncomfortable.
I'm uncomfortable. And in my early part of my career, I didn't feel comfortable speaking up about these things. But in the last little bit, I'm like, I'm uncomfortable. Can we not do this?
Yeah.
You know,
Can I just interject to just get Sam, what are your thoughts around this in terms of, as a designer, have you ever been the only Indigenous designer in a room? What are you seeing in the sector that alarms you or that you think needs more attention?
I would say for most of my career, I have been the only Indigenous designer.
Wow.
Which is definitely very interesting. I would say for the most part, I think because the directors I've worked with, like with Kim, with Jenny Lozen, with Kevin Loring, and briefly I was brought onto a project by Fallon Johnson. I think because I had those directors to make space for me and hold space for me, where, you know, I wasn't the only Indigenous person on the whole team, which I think very much had a positive impact on me. I've certainly had moments where I've had to talk to non-Indigenous artistic leadership, wherein I had to kind of, you know, after conversations with the directors, we'd reached a certain agreement, like, okay, great, this is direction we're going, these are the choices we've made, it all makes sense. And then I had to go to artistic leadership and justify those choices. And I don't think it was necessarily coming from a place of negativity or anything like that, but more of like a desire for understanding. But it still felt very weird for me because the choices we made were coming from a ceremony, or, you know, revolving around regalia or things like that. And it was just a very weird experience for me to have to sit there and, you know, justify everything. So I've had, like, again, I would say, you know, it's very interesting to be the only Indigenous person, and I truly hope that, you know, that changes over time.
And with regards to as a costume designer, you're leading design, you're, managing a team of people executing all of the making work. How often do you run into companies that have Indigenous makers and seamstresses that can not just do the work, but help the work become exceptional? Is there a gap in knowledge there that you're finding you encounter a lot?
I was thinking about this back a few months ago. I was realizing that in 3 years of working, I only this year in 2020 have encountered a wardrobe that had people of color, BIPOC people, let alone Indigenous people. And this year I was able to work with a company that had both an Indigenous person and a BIPOC person in their wardrobe, which again, I didn't know that I had all that tension going into those spaces until I had that experience, because I just had this enormous amount of relief that, okay, I have a safe place to give this to. I don't have to, and I still kind of, there were still non-Indigenous people there. So I still kind of did a bit of a spiel and being like, okay, in our culture, we have to put good thoughts into every single stitch. And we have a different, this isn't a job. You're making these important pieces, and to just have that level of understanding all ready to go.
This isn't a bitch and stitch. This is not a bitch and stitch. That is not okay when you're building regalia. Yeah. And the labor you have to do, the education, Sam, you have to do is, I can only imagine, immense.
Yeah,
Yo-Yo.
I'm just thinking, and I'm wondering about the lack of Indigenous designers, and the handful of designers that we have who are incredible. But I guess I'm just wondering about institutions that teach these elements of design, and what outreach they're doing to communities that for youth that might be interested in this sort of thing, that some youth don't have the same privileges and access as that urban youth do. And so who's responsible for that? You know what I mean?
Organizations are, because this is relational, and if you don't have community engagement, you're not being anti-racist. That's my belief.
100%. Because even in Thunder Bay, my reserve is in Thunder Bay. It's it's the same thing, but we're just right next to it. But we don't know, when I was growing up, outside of that area, I knew nothing about what was offered or what was available. Growing up, didn't think that, going to a school for something that I love to do was an option. I didn't know that until I was in my 20s. So, and that's in Thunder Bay. That's not that's just that one area. I'm thinking even further north, how much do people, how much are youth aware of options that are available for them, and why aren't people doing more to engage with them?
Are you saying there's a gap when Karen's daughter, who comes in to be come to the cabaret, when Karen's child is not being indigenously competent? Are you trying to tell me there's a gap here in
just
the
a little
system here? I don't know, Yo-Yo. Emily, what do you got on this?
Well, I was gonna say that aside from the I don't have empirical evidence that there is a lack of outreach, but I would put a very strong bet on on that. But also the process applying for theater school, I would argue, is super colonial, because usually what ends up happening, at least when you're going to a conservatory style program for design, is first you need a portfolio, which implies that you have been able to make a portfolio. So hopefully there's community theater where you are, or maybe semi-professional theaters that will let you tried, untested designer deal with their tiny budgets and make them something. But
and that's assuming they're not racist.
Yeah, right. So assuming you can even get that experience, which is much more unlikely if you're in a super tiny town and you also are dealing with colonial attitudes and racism. But then you're usually sent a play to design, which often is something classic, like classic, you know, so
What's
you
a
might
classic
have
play?
so you know you might have
Andromeda,
like a
Agamemnon.
piece of Shakespeare, or you know, Moliere, or you know,
Chekhov.
Chekhov.
They have one about
UNESCO.
sisters doing
Three
a thing.
sisters.
Three sisters.
That's stolen from us.
I think I had to wear a rehearsal skirt when I did that, and I bustled on
Did you do that at BFA? Yeah. We did that at the BFA.
Yeah.
But anyway, so then you have to design a play that you might not be interested in, or might not speak to you, or you might not have had the formal education to be able to pick it apart in the way that theater school wants you to pick it apart. So like even by the time you get to an interview, I'd say the odds are very stacked against non-white students.
And that is institutional racism. Mishelle.
Oh, for sure.
Well, I just like sort of expanding on that. I think that whenever I talk about anything in this realm, it comes back to power imbalance, right? And like there's nothing, the biggest issue, and it's not like it extends to issues around BIPOC representation, but it also is every single person in this industry. The reason it is problematic is because the power imbalances are huge, even when it's a small company that has no money and they just want to do a show, and the producers themselves probably don't feel like they have a lot of power. They are inherently the ones with the money, hiring from a pool of precarious workers who do not have a salaried job. And because of that, the fear of blacklisting or of being considered difficult or of not doing a good enough job is pervasive to the point that it makes people very, very, it's very, very hard on mental health. So when a young person is coming up, so I didn't go to design school. I went to the BFA, the same one that Kim did. And I remember seeing her when she was in shows, but she didn't know me because I was just like coming up. It's okay. I'm just going to bug you about it forever.
Going to school. Sorry.
I thought she was so cool. But I did acting school, but you know, I had the benefit of being a musician as a kid, and I very much fell into it because I came up around, like, I graduated in 2011. So right around then it was when like people were just like, ooh, hire a woman sound designer. So I think I for sure got some like legs up in terms of affirmative action there, which I was like, absolutely, I will take it. And so I said yes to things I was not qualified for. I struggled through it. I made my way, and it was terrifying, and I cried a lot. But that's how I got up there. And because I was an educated white girl who knew how to write an email because my dad's a lawyer, like I was able to do that. And I was able to go into a contract negotiation, and I knew how to talk about money because my parents had talked to me about money. So I knew how to, I still did my paying my dues thing a little bit, but I was able to say like, no, you can't do that to me. So, but when I say like, if for me, it was that hard, like you're not giving anyone a chance who doesn't have language around talking about money or advocating for themselves or how to write a professional sounding email. Because those are the things that get you the job, really. It's not the design portfolio. It's how you write an email. It's how you make a phone call. It's who you know to call.
Yep, absolutely.
And so there has to be a deep, deep understanding by the folks who are hiring that you can't play hardball with people. Like, I don't care. And honestly, the other thing, sorry, just to go, mentorship and training and assistance is another big part of helping people get up and get those skills. And when I've worked with Kim, we did have the benefit of working on a project that had quite a bit of funding. And so because of that, there were a lot of different people that could come in and work on these design teams. And when I talk to white people, when I talk to settlers about like, how do I do this? How do I make Indigenous art? I'm like, it's just more expensive. Like it's not actually that like weird and crazy and challenging for you. You'll understand how to do it. You just have to spend more money. And that's, I think, the hard pill to swallow sometimes.
And education, Mishelle, like you did your due diligence in terms of understanding Indigenous diaspora and ontology. Mishelle, Emily, I want to throw it to you quickly, and then we're going to come to Sam to talk about your experience on Kamloops. Emily, in the sector right now, what is making you uncomfortable? What are the challenges when you first started coming into working with Indigenous work? Like, in the embodiment of being vulnerable, because working internationally requires a significant amount of vulnerability and trust, what was it like for you coming into that piece that was immensely Indigenous and matriarchal?
Yeah, I mean, well, the first thing was like when I read it, I like fell in love with it. So there's no way any amount of like fear or other emotions or the fact that I was across the country would keep me from it. But I think the concept as particularly as a video designer, that's always really daunting is creating visuals that I feel comfortable as a white person presenting for an Indigenous story, because obviously that's a really easy place to fall into the like cultural appropriation trap.
Yep.
Because I can't make visuals that are imitating like a Coast Salish style. You know, that's not something I would feel comfortable with if someone was like, "Hey, can you make this picture?" But I mean,
Can you do an Anishinaabe woodland?
Nope.
Yeah.
So that's always really daunting, but it's also an opportunity to figure out like how you connect to the piece and how you can bring like my heritage and feelings and knowledge, which I think we did really well with Kamloops because we played a lot with shadows and more realistic depictions of animals. But it was also like a great opportunity on Skyborn where we had much more money to be able to be like visual artists, sculptural artists,
carvers,
visual team.
Yeah.
So that's a great way because then you can have that exchange and you have someone who is able to create the art in the style because it's their style, they're embodying it, it's their culture and lineage, and then I can work with that and animate it and bring it into the theatrical realm, and there can be a give and take there. But like the concept of creating visuals that like don't belong to me in any way and I would not want to take them, like that's like a scary thing to like when you're approaching video design as a white person.
And I think one thing, because I want people to leave this with like practical applications and strategies for ensuring they're not being appropriative, is that Emily took the initiative. I'm not sure if this is a standard for every art institution, but when we talked briefly and I didn't know your work, I think we said like, could you send me something or understand where you're at? And you had sent me this beautiful, basically like pitch package and like folder of like ideas and visuals that I could get a sense from you what your like cultural competency and innovation and courage was. Did you want to speak to a little bit about that practice and how you could offer that to other designers when they're wanting to work with Indigenous leaders?
Yeah, so this is actually just part of my design process in general. Like it's how I approach all my designs. I think that it part of why it drives so well here is because particularly Kim, you're like a very like you work well with visuals and we can really talk about it. But director to director, it depends on how effective sending a group of abstract images is. But what I
saw it was like, hire her, give her all the money.
But so basically what I do is I'll read the text like a whole bunch of times and then I'll write things. I won't draw anything. And then after that, I'll just start like Googling images that sort of like speak on a like internal intrinsic level to like feelings about the play. So it's not like moments or anything like that. There's no text, and it'll go sort of down those like really great Google rabbit holes where you're like shadows, caustics, empty wine bottle, glass sculpture, like, and you just like follow down, and whenever anything is like that, then I save it into my folder of like hundreds of pictures, and then afterwards I sort of curate it. And when you're looking at them afterwards, you can sort of start to see themes. So like you know, like nature versus the city, like that is a very loose theme. But like when you're looking at your image that you saved and all of a sudden you have like a bunch of concrete pillars with plants growing out of them, you're like, oh, that's like a tension that spoke to me when I read it. So then I put those all together and I send them off, and then I think that's always a good launching point in terms of discussion, because then you're not discussing moments, you're discussing like feelings.
Yeah, and what really works with that is that you're not just being like, well, if I'm not doing Indigenous stuff, what am I doing? And putting more labor on the director and putting more labor on the other designers. You showed up with offers, with fullness, with the ability to say, let's navigate these cultural cross lines and these horizons, and then just say, you know what, I'm feeling this or I'm feeling that. To me, that's what it means for an artist and as a designer. And I need to work with people who show up with their hands full, with their pockets full, with all of their bags and spirits full, making offer after offer after offer, so that I'm not having to be prescriptive around their design work. Sam, I want to come back to you. Thank you so much, Emily and Mishelle, for that, around the work on Kamloopa and how working with an Indigenous and non-Indigenous team, working, and this is something that I want to be specific and talk about, is internation work, about being Indigenous, but designing for nations outside of your own. And so with Kamloopa, those performers were Silk, and I think, Yolanda, for that production, we ended up deciding that Indian friend number one was, because you had said, I've never played an Anishinaabe woman before, and I didn't prescribe it in that because she was a shifter. And so, Sam, what was that like for you? And also, I just want to like introduce Sam and her work with Kamloopa, because I think so much happened with that production. And I'll say it, I think I was pissed about the lack of acknowledgement and the lack of work in detail that Sam did on that show, with one, not getting a Jessie nomination, and two, people not understanding the specifics and the rigorous work she did around creating new Indigenous regalia, about creating 30 plus costumes with tuna can lid jingle dresses, with creating a Pocahontas costume that Yolanda just loved being in, that she created this world of design, of art, that I still like satiate around the fact that every time she would show me a piece, I would either be laughing uncontrollably or immensely and deeply in love with her. But it looks like we might have just lost Sam.
Too much praise.
Yeah, she was like, I gotta get out of here. Too much love. But maybe Yo-Yo, while we're holding this space, because I do want to give Sam McCue the attention and respect that I don't believe she received on her work with Kamloopa, and even with Thanks for Giving, the fucking work she did for these shows, and really the lack of people understanding the extent of her execution with regards to the detail and meticulousness, courage and competency. What was it like for you wearing the Pocahontas costume, wearing the Captain Fraser costume, wearing the Raven costume? And that's just one character in that show.
Yeah, it was, there was something I had never, I've never experienced.
Sorry, Sam, we're still speaking your praises, and now Yolanda's going to talk about how nourishing it was to embody all of your amazingness. I've just been saying, I just want you to have the respect and time that these nations deserve to understand the incredible power you have as a costume designer. So Yo-Yo.
Yeah, there was something really, and power was the best. I think there was something really powerful about wearing regalia created for you. And even if it was like the Pocahontas costume, which like, to me, like when I looked at all the costumes, like they were all regalia. It didn't matter if it was like a pair of jeans or like the Oka outfit, like, you know, like these, to me, it all felt sort of in that realm, because the entire story was a ceremony. Therefore, everything we wore was part of that ceremony. Therefore, everything we wore was regalia. And so whenever, before every show, and whenever I would smudged all of the costumes. There was something so incredibly powerful about that. I was so nervous about wearing a beaded G-string on stage.
Oh yeah.
But that whole costume, and every costume I wore, whatever discomfort I felt was gone. I became a raven when I put on the raven. Like it fed my performance in so deeply that there aren't really words for it. Like the minute I put those feathers on, like it was just like, I could feel it. The minute I put the Pocahontas costume on, I was like, this is the best thing I'm ever gonna wear on stage, ever.
As a director coming in, when Sam was like, it's time. And I was like, the Pocahontas costume is here. And I came in and you're like, I think you cried and I almost cried, because we actually talked about how hot and sexy and beautiful you were. And I was getting update by updates on the G-string. And Sam would be like, okay, so this is the beadwork we've worked on today. And this is the beadwork. And it's like, it was immensely, you did it with dignity and just a sexiness and a courage. And Yolanda, also we had two options for that piece, which again, as Indigenous women, maybe Sam, I'll throw it to you around your process around making sure that Yolanda had that experience of coming into the costume room and not knowing she had to go in and have a battle around how inappropriate or how the work hadn't been done. So Sam, take it away. How did you do Kamloopa?
Oh my gosh, it was a very important show in my career, having only been designing for about 3 years. And I think by the time I did Kamloopa, I was only a year into my career. And it was the biggest project, I would say, for me to take on, just because there were so many little details in each and every costume that I wanted to be aware of, and so much history to bring in. And so I think, I love what Yolanda was talking about with having, the costumes being regalia and the show being ceremony, because that informs a lot of how I work and how I view the costumes that I make. And it's definitely an interesting position to be in, when we're talking about modern versus historical, and how when we're handling traditional wear and traditional garb, especially as someone who may not have associations with that particular nation, there's a lot. I'm always a little bit worried, and I always try to acknowledge, that even though I'm the Indigenous designer here, that doesn't mean that I know, what's okay for, Coast Salish, or I know what's okay for Maliseet, or, Haudenosaunee. Like, there are so many little nuances in every culture that I may miss. I will do my absolute best to presence as much as I can in the work. And I kind of tried to do my best to honor the ancestors, because a lot of the research I'm doing revolves looking into those things. Mm-hmm. And another big, we were talking about it kind of at the beginning, but the idea of consent is another really important work. And I'm not entirely sure, again, because I'm still relatively new to the industry, but I do my best to ask a lot of questions in the fitting room and leading into things, because I feel like I don't have full ownership of the character that I'm doing. I have my analysis and I have my research and all this stuff that feeds into it, but Yolanda's going to be the only one who knows if this is exactly, right for this character. So I try to incorporate actor, director feedback, so that I acknowledge that, I've kind of got a creative vision for what's happening here, but I can't claim individual ownership over that. This needs to be circular. It needs to be, a give and take. And like, my mom's people come from potlatch tradition, where, we have to share our wealth and we have to share everything in order to make decisions that affect all of us. And so I take that very seriously in my work, because I don't feel comfortable if Yolanda's not comfortable, or, you know, going into that. So that's kind of, you know, where I come in with a lot of things. Kamloopa also challenged me, I would say, because we were dealing with so much
What do you mean?
stereotypical
There's like Simon Fraser, Pocahontas, like
Pocahontas,
like the Oka, like the dab
The
made
shirt.
The medicine woman.
the medicine woman. Well, should the feather go in her face here, or should it go on this side? Is it you? You came in one time, was like, is she have enough like white lady hippie jewelry on? I was like, I don't know, Sam, Yolanda, what do you think? There was so much you did, Sam.
Yeah. And sort of to kind of like what you said earlier, you brought up something really important, Kim, like when we were talking about safety, the option was, so the back of my costume was a thong, and like in the front there was like a buckskin piece. And so I had the option, if I wasn't comfortable, to put a flap on it. So there was another like part that was created for me in case I, for some reason that day, didn't want to show my butt. Yep. And so there was something about just knowing that that was there. I don't think I ever used it.
No, you didn't. But the flap was there.
The flap was there as an option. And so it didn't like it which was like a safety net for me.
Mm-hmm. And I think too that, and I'll go back to the front of that skirt, because one, I think this is a really good micro example of internation Indigenous work. Two Anishinaabes, an interior Salish, creating a collaborative practice and diligence. So that's an example of how Indigenous internation works. But also then we're going to add in the white portion. Emily had to like design and put, and Daniela had to put on lighting and projection when she revealed the Pocahontas. And I remember there was also, and Sam or Yolanda and Emily, please interrupt me, was around, we had to have an image painted on that looked like an angry vagina.
Yeah.
It's my favorite.
Emily was like, I can't see it, or I don't know if I can light it. And so Emily in the costume department had to work. And then Yolanda also had to feel comfortable. And so to me, that was a really great example of Yolanda, of internation collaboration around lighting an angry vagina image on a Pocahontas costume. And if you don't have the capacity to do that, I don't know if you should be creating in theater.
It's the story of two suns rising.
Two
suns rising.
Yeah, I mean, like in general theater, I would argue is all collaboration. So, you know, I think that maybe the like biggest moment was like figuring out how to match the level of the regalia, the animal regalia, right, at the end, and like how, because Sam brought such this like huge emotional beat, and then it's like, how do we bring the rest of the show with it, right? Because, you know, seeing those cloaks go on and like the full raven. Also, when you say that, like, you're like, as soon as I put the raven on, I felt like the raven, like that was very visible. It'd be like the raven has arrived. I mean, the raven was always sort of there whenever there was any laughing in particular, but
and Sam, just before we move on to the next area, which is going to be the advice and the like how we can do these collaborations so we can laugh and have joy around it and then not be stressful and we're not afraid of fear. Did you want to talk a little bit about your practice around creating that regalia at the end, about creating those silk capes, about the work that you did around what that was? Because I just remember when you showed me what they were and you said I was just like astounded and so appreciative. Again, Sam coming with offers, Sam coming with her research done for internation collaboration. So I'm sure people would love to hear, and especially young Indigenous designers, around when an artistic leader is asking you to evolve culture, to create regalia. What was your process like to do that?
It was very, again, there's always a bit of an interesting process for me when I'm given a specific nation to represent. And so for me, it always starts with grounding it in that culture, making sure I'm doing the appropriate research into materials, into silhouettes and things like that. So when I was asked to create, a piece of regalia at the end to symbolize, you know, these characters arriving in their spirit form and meeting this, you know, becoming one with the spirits that are guiding them. That was just such an important moment that I really wanted to make sure that the ancestors of the characters were being seen in those silhouettes, in those materials. Like we used fur, we used something that looked like cedar fringe, and we, you know, all for McCue, we used an actual coyote pelt. And so for those types of things, I tried to make those choices so that those ancestral qualities are part of that piece, but also, you know, bringing it to today with materials that we have today, with, you know, trying to make sure that those things that we're honoring them, we're also making sure that they fit in with the world that we've created, and things like that. So that's kind of like my process going into it, because it was just such an important moment that I just really wanted to make sure that those ancestors were present in that moment, because that's, you know, what we do ceremony for, that's what we do our art for, to acknowledge our history, to acknowledge those ancestors. And so I really needed that to be a part of the story that we were telling. So yeah.
And beautifully executed. I remember when they came out and we saw that final image of them, the reflection of transformation. You know, one of my favorite images that Tim Matheson took was of Samantha, Sam Brown holding her heart with the headband, with the cape, with the cedar material, that what you're saying, that shape and silhouette. It's such a moving photo to me, and I can't extend my gratefulness that I was able to work with you and make space for you to explore and innovate in costume. So we're going to move to the next portion of this around, you know, what does this actually mean? What have our experiences been? The good, the bad, the ugly. Mishelle, I'll kick it over to you to talk about your experiences as a non-Indigenous person working under the tyranny of me. Just joking. Or, you know, like
tyranny of Kim.
The tyranny of Kim.
Yeah, you know,
I'm not. I don't even know the plural for that.
Tyrannical.
Tyrannical.
Tyrannosaurus Rex.
You guys are lying. That's a white person lie, is it? Okay, Mishelle.
Okay, what can I say? I have lots of things to say, but I just I guess I'll start with just talking about there is a learning, right, about how to be in the room. But again, I always come back to, it seems, I think that we think it's something that's like really, really hard and scary. And then we realize that's just sort of how you should be as a person. Like when you're in a room and thinking about what you're going to say and like who the other people are, like it's so like my first, I did work on, my very, very first experience working on an Indigenous led project was I did a 2-day workshop on Lisa Ravensbergen's show, Seventh Fire. So I did have a couple days in there, it's a beautiful show. And I just sort of came on a little bit after it had begun its process. And, you know, there's just a real learning about what those spaces feel like, what it's like to be in those rooms, how to, the tricky thing is as a designer when I'm brought in is that there's a lot of listening, but there's also a lot of leadership required for me to execute the work. And so I feel like over the last sort of year or two, as I've begun to be in these spaces, it's really the thing that I'm learning the most is about when is it about listening and giving space, and when is it about action and getting stuff done. And so our work on Skyborn, it was good because there was a workshop in the summer that was a 3-week thing, and then there was a bunch of time in between that and doing the production. And so when I first stepped into that room, like there's certainly, you know, there's this feeling of like, and I feel like it was echoed a lot over the last few months after the murder of George Floyd, which what we're seeing on the internet is that a lot of white people are very, very scared. And very scared about saying the wrong thing, and very nervous and very confused, which is like that's like totally real and fine. But there's also a big learning about being able to just kind of not know and being able to like be like, it's okay. And, if you're being respectful and thoughtful, you can say something stupid accidentally and you can apologize for it. Or you can make an offer that is not a good offer, and then you can hear, actually, sorry, that's not appropriate for whatever reason. You can say, okay, sorry, and then that's it. Like, it doesn't have to be a big thing that means you're a bad person.
But I will say, just to intersect, that it's also Indigenous leaders' job to not make it a big deal. You know, we can't be anti-courageous, shameful based, being like, oh, that was so inappropriate. Like, that was so ignorant. That was so whatever. I think Indigenous leaders and producers have to take more of a responsibility. Like, and I've unfortunately bared witness to being some creators like laugh at their designers. And I was like, wow, that's really unfortunate that that's how you're responding to their offers are. That's just inappropriate to me. And I don't like working with people that. So I want to make sure Indigenous people take responsibility to what you're saying, Mishelle, that when you do make offers, that they're received respectfully.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think that the more trust there is on both sides, then the more space there is for those things to happen, right? For a designer to feel like, okay, I know what I'm doing enough that I can say this, and I also, that this person will hear it, and they'll either say, that's great, or they'll say, you know what, that's not appropriate, or it's not right for the show, or whatever. Like, but that trust is important, and it takes time, and it's like an exercise. It's like a muscle you have to build. It's how to be in those spaces is like a muscle, and it's a little more work. It's a little more work, and you're tired at the end of the day. And then I think, you know what, that's kind of how we should be when we're with people, when we're working with people on creative projects, is no matter who's in the room, we really should be thinking like one more step before we say something, you know, or really thinking like, who am I interrupting in this space, and what, like, that stuff is just normal human stuff. And so again, all these lessons,
who am I interrupting?
They should be taken back to every project, every single time, you know, being aware of where people are at in terms of their own lives. It's like good to do that. So, I mean, there's that one thing in terms of just how to be in the space. And then understanding that your job is to get stuff done. It's not just to like sit and listen and be scared. It's to actually execute the work. And that requires bravery, and it requires actually making offers. Because I think that if, and we've talked about this a lot, Kim, is that if an Indigenous leader is saying, I want to hire you, then they're asking you to do the job. And then there has to be some freeing up about the fear. There just has to be some sort of allowance of the work to happen. Yeah.
Can I just intersect that my sister and I were talking about this morning about the fact that I find that people who have a lot of fear, who have a lot of shame, are actually not at the level they need to be of doing their anti-racist work that they need to be to execute at this level. That it's a reflection of the anti-oppression work that they have to go and do, and the internal spiritual anti-imperialist work that they have to go and do. And I find that designers who haven't done that work, who come in with the assumption that this is just business as usual, that come into letting fear be their determining factor, so they obstruct themselves from working. They actually have to go do the work beforehand to make sure that they can arrive ready to work. And that's not my job as a director. That's not my job as a producer. Getting you ready to work and making sure you're prepared is everyone's own responsibility. And when you're working internationally and collaboratively, do not expect the director, you know, I feel like I do make a lot of offers in the room to take care of people, but please don't, you know, misinterpret my generosity and kindness around creating safe spaces as for people to show up and not being prepared. And I think I do create deliberate spaces where sometimes we do have to work at a pace. And, you know, I think for Kamloopa, when I looked at the schedule, we did Kamloopa in a 17-day rehearsal period minus 2 days off. So that's like 15 days we did that show. And so for me, those people had to show prepared, ready, having done that anti-racist work to be in the room and ready to make decisions at a pace that allowed us to get to the end. Mishelle, I want to hold this space again for you around what it was like for you running a team of internation and mixed race for the sound design of that, you know, very deliberate Salish sounding production.
It was really like nourishing and rewarding, and also like I think at a certain point I realized what my job was, which made everything a bit easier. And what I realized was that because of that particular project, there were a lot of people on the sound team, but most of them didn't have the capacity or the availability to be around all the time. So I was sort of the one holding it, gathering things, doing a lot of logistical work, honestly. Like the thing that I could offer was saying, okay, we're going to record, we need people in this day, here's the time, we're going to go rent the gear. And then me doing that meant that no one else was expected to do that, and that the folks who we could utilize their time really well. So we had these 3 really, really amazing recording sessions with Chelsea Rose and Caitlin Yacht and Renai Moroso and Russell Wallace, where we went into a room and, part of my thought process was like, I want to find a space that's really beautiful and really clean and really like nice and comfortable. And we got people together and they did a bunch of improvising, and Russell spent a whole couple hours doing different stuff on the drum. And so then because appropriation with music is, it's really, you cannot avoid it. And if you're not playing European music, every single thing you're playing is appropriated from Black culture, from Latin culture, it's kind of what it is, and understanding and reconciling what that means as a composer is its own challenge.
Yeah.
One of the best things about that project was that I wasn't actually asked to generate too much music. I had to create a lot of sound, but by gathering all these Indigenous artists together to play, I just had this like huge, like tons of stuff to play with. And then I, as the sort of person bringing it together, felt really comfortable throwing things in, because there was one traditional Musqueam song, paddle song, that Christy Lee brought in, Christy Lee Charles, right?
Yep.
Which she asked permission from the Musqueam women to share that with us.
So that's consent and acknowledgement within the process.
And it was also very specific that we could use that song we could not take and manipulate and mess around with. But there was a really interesting process in her as a Musqueam woman teaching the other Indigenous singers this song, which they didn't know. And she did a lot of educating around that. And the other music that we created was this was all newly generated, so there was a lot more freedom in creating it. And I think that one other thing around consent that I think is really interesting is that sometimes, like in that situation, you will get positive consent. More often than not, you'll either get like, don't do this, or you'll get a couple people who say, yes, it's okay. And then you have to kind of make a decision about what you feel. And you're never going to get some magical person saying, yes, you can do this. Yes, it's okay. Like, because that's impossible unless every single Indigenous person from that whole nation tells you it's okay. So we all have to make our own judgment calls and decide with the team, with the people, whether or not something feels appropriate and comfortable in that situation.
And I'll go to you, Yo, in just one sec. I want to honor again the detailed work that you did, Mishelle, with regards to not only holding space for Indigenous women to get together and create songs and create music and honor the traditional paddle song, but also in the sense that it wasn't just like, I said, I need Cosmo music, I need cosmic space music. You weren't like, let me go to Soundfile and just pull it. The thought you went around to get Russell creating a safe space for Russell to use rattles and shells and his drum, I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, the majority, 95% of all of that cosmic sound design was rooted, culturally grounded in Indigenous instruments. And did you want to speak about that little process too, about how important that was? Because when you hear it, it's not good enough as juries, as audience members to just think, oh, they just pulled this music, but to do the work to understand that Mishelle had the integrity, thought, and respect to create soundscapes, that we played a little bit with on Kamloopa. I want to mention Chris Dirksen, about you guys singing in the costume room, about creating the space, but how you're rooting the culture within Indigenous-centric musicians, leaders, and instruments to presence, like what Sam McCue was saying, our ancestors and their cultural heritage.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really it. And, Russell's such a brilliant human, and he has so many things to offer as a person and as an artist, and making that space. And so I knew we were lucky, or we were not lucky. This is how it should be. We knew we were going into a situation with a show that had scoring for the entire 75 minutes of the show. So I then said, I need to be in the room every single day, because otherwise I cannot do my job. And I need to have all of this content ready so that I'm not running around after rehearsal trying to get this recorded and missing days in rehearsal. So I had that time to be able to say what we need, because that show was very, very rich in terms of the layers of audio that it needed. It just was present all of the time. And yes, that was so, and it was, yes, that's what I was thinking. And also, but also we're just like, hey, Russell, what can you do? Like, show us some stuff, play around. And again, it comes back to money, because we had money to go and rent those spaces, rent that gear, pay Russell, pay me. Like, that's what it requires. And so that's how it should be in a situation like this. That's how it needs to be, but it's not. I always come back to this because it seems like this, like, floofy, like we just talk about these ideas, but no, you just got to pay for it. And you have to pay for people to be there and be comfortable and relaxed, because Russell, he came in we had like him for like 3 hours, and he just brought all his stuff and was very relaxed, and we had snacks and we could chat and sort of jam and say, oh, can you do this? So what's another thing? And he also brought like rattles that were not Indigenous to here. I think he brought some South American stuff. He brought some just tools and stuff he could play with from all around. So yeah, it's all, with music, when you get people in and they're comfortable and they're relaxed, you can just create
in the space. And Yolanda, I'll come to you. Chris really had an incredible creative practice around playing her cello in the morning of Kamloopa, and the three of you singing and jiving, and everyone was singing. Do you want to speak about that process for you, about how that grounded your ability? Because Kamloopa also had a significant amount of singing, whether it be the Log Driver's Waltz or the Matriarch. So what was that like for you?
It was beautiful. I had never had the opportunity to work like that, and because I was relatively new with my drum, because I was drumming, I had never been given space to sort of explore what my voice would sound like with my drum with other in a full space. And so there was something really nice about us just sitting there and jamming with Chris Dirksen. It's like I think about that experience often, actually, because it was very you don't get that opportunity often to just sort of improv and on the fly. And we created some beautiful soundscapes that and they weren't all used, but the fact that they were created, even just the fact that they existed was beautiful. And yeah, like us squished into that little dressing room or the costume room to like record was like something else, but it was really moving and really freeing. There was something really freeing about it. I also wanted to presence the Shweknik women who came in to teach us the honor song. And that was incredibly important and deeply rooted in the respect that we had for the territory. And that, I performed that song every night while Caitlin and Sam did the dance moves. And I remember how diligent we were about like making sure that it was correct and that we were listening to it over and over again. And every night I felt so honored to be able to sing a song that's not from my nation, but on a territory, the territory that song originated on. And what was the most beautiful thing was watching when people stood up or people sang along with it, so that there was this like, they felt seen or heard by us just presenting the song, and they would stand up or they would sing along. And it was just so incredibly moving.
Thank you, Yolanda. Emily, do you want to talk about advice? Because I feel like we, clicked really quickly, but also one of the things I appreciate out of you, and I will say, I think the Kamloopa crew set me up for problems because of how diligent, quick, hardworking, rigorous, and competent they were, because I honestly can't believe what we did in 15 days. And I expect that level of rigor in many situations while still rooted with integrity and respect. And I've seen it done, and that's why I can be demanding when it comes to execution, because I've seen it happen. And so Emily, what was it like for you coming across? I remember you mentioned to me once too, you were like, I excused processes before Kamloopa. Do you want to speak? And I want to just hear and make space for you around what you think think people can learn from, and what's served you well in these processes?
Yeah, for sure. Like there was, I mean, I would say vice versa. Kamloops has also set other theater experiences up for failure for me as well. Because there's a lot of things that we did in Kamloops that made it a very human experience and a very enjoyable experience. And like, yeah, it was a lot, but when your working environment is so warm and welcoming and thoughtful and nourishing, like the prospect of working long days or working long hours, or even the like ever-present smoke draining into our lungs from the fires.
Hazardous. The air quality was hazardous.
It's like, oh, is there a theater through there? No, only smoke. But like none of that really felt draining or daunting in the way that a lot of theatrical practices do when you're working in less ideal environments. Also, I'd like to say, like, in terms of fear, like fear is a paralytic, right? So as soon as you're afraid, you're not going to be moving, you're not going to be going forwards. So it's important to like acknowledge that fear and then like move through it, because like shoving it aside doesn't work either, because then you're just repressing things, which is like perhaps worse. So sitting in the discomfort, sitting in the fear, figuring out why you're afraid, what is scaring you, and then moving past it is super important. Like there's definitely like on Kamloops, which was like a gorgeous environment, there's still scary things. Like for me as a white person being invited to learn how to powwow dance, that is a scary thing.
I said all the designers are invited to do everything all the time, and like they did. So we had powwow dancing, we learned the Schleswig song, and everyone was, and that's the thing with that production. Everybody showed up to work every day and participate to be vulnerable. Everybody was so vulnerable and so generously trusting.
Respectful.
Yeah. So, you know, it also when you engage in experiences like that, you gain a deeper understanding.
Okay.
Oh, sorry? You're frozen a bit. We're not frozen though, so I'm gonna keep talking. When you engage in practices like a powwow workshop, or learning the songs that the actors are learning, or even on one of our first days you brought your drum and we all sang together, and like I'm the sort of person who gets mild anxiety when they're like, all right, now Emily, introduce yourself with your name. So like the concept of like singing a song from an Indigenous person, and I don't really sing, and like all of that is terrifying. But when you work through the fear, you gain a greater understanding of the piece and the people you're working with and the culture and the processes, and that lets you dig deeper into your work.
Yeah.
I feel so lost now that Kim's gone.
We'll just keep talking.
My guiding force.
Oh, she's
there she is.
Yeah, so I was just saying, Kim, how when you work through fear, you gain a deeper understanding of what you're doing. So like in terms of like practices, like just listening a lot, coming with offers, doing your own research on your own time, like don't take up the space, like make a mental note of something you don't understand and then go use the old Googs. Like yeah, everyone carries a tiny computer with them at all times. Use it.
The old Googs.
The old Googs.
We're very close. Yeah, and I swear I had a thought.
I do want to pick your brain, Emily, around the emphasis on relationship and how I know a lot of people say Indigenous theater is relational and what that actually means for you and in practice. And like you can speak truth to me all the time, what that looks like as a director, as a writer, as producers, making space, and what that relationship looks like for you and I and between other designers, and how that's integral, that designers don't just come in for an hour and leave. They're part of circles. You know, it's important for me, you know, we have many different modalities that, but maybe to share people with tools, what's worked with you and what we kind of do on the shows that we work together on.
Yeah, I mean, like, I've said this many times to anyone who will listen to me. Sharing and creating theater not in a bubble is super important. As soon as you're precious about your work, as soon as you again, as soon as you have that fear that like maybe people aren't going to like it, maybe people aren't going to get it, it's not done, I don't want to show it, blah 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 blah, you're not moving forwards, you're not moving at the speed that you could be, and you're not going to be creating these intersections in your work that you will if you open it up. So Google Drive is a really big one so that everyone can see what everyone is doing, you know, like being able to go on the sound folder and see like what Mishelle has created will inform what I'm doing with video, you know, even if that's not a bit that we're going to get to in the rehearsal space for the next 5 days, right? Like, being able to have these communications and being able to see what other people are doing is super important. Kim, we always have like a design WhatsApp, which is great because it allows like rapid fire thoughts versus like writing emails are so formal.
And because we're all in different time zones, and you will work with that a lot when you're working internationally from artists, as Yolanda had said, because there's not a lot of Indigenous designers yet, and we're working across Turtle Island, having WhatsApp allows people to respond when they're ready to, and I never demand that people respond as soon as I WhatsApp them.
Yeah.
This is also like years out in advance now, which is important to me anyways, but continue.
And yeah, just having like group conversations with the whole design team. So you don't, I think that, Kim, you brought this up, I think on Kamloopa or afterwards, you were saying like, if we finish a rehearsal day at 5, and then I have to have a meeting with like every designer for an hour afterwards, your labor is like,
too much.
So it's not as productive because you're either having to have similar conversations or it's on you, which is like a very colonial way of making theater, to make the interconnections between the different design practices, which shouldn't happen. It should be the designers and the director all working together, creating those bridges, creating those neurons, those thought pathways, because the work will be stronger and it takes labor off of everyone because it's shared. And making art with people you don't trust or you don't know, it is never as good an experience as when you all are actually working together and speaking the same sort of visual language, as it were, or auditory language.
Thanks.
Design language.
Thanks, Emily. We'll go to Mishelle and then Sam.
Yeah, I just want to say that, like, from the other side of that, I feel like, Kim, you make it a priority to acknowledge the work of the designers and invite us and include us in the space. And that is not a small thing, especially I can just offer that in the last, 4 months, as theater has been not happening among the design community, there's been a real feeling, especially as people are like, well, we can just do a Zoom show from our home and design doesn't matter. There's been a real, I think, general culture that always exists around designers being like, does anyone care what we do? Does anyone appreciate this work that we're putting in? And you do, and it is so incredible to be in spaces where it's really spoken about out loud. And I would say that, probably, sound and costumes are the ones that people, don't think about because they don't necessarily process what the work that's been putting into them. And so that is not a small thing, to feel like you're valued and to feel like you matter in the space. And again, that makes the trust. It means that we're more excited to be there and to be included and have conversations and make those offers between the design disciplines and work together. It just, it's so and a lot of it comes from designers or people being underpaid, so they have to do a million jobs at once, and then they're not able to be present all the time or whatever, and it's just becomes very hard. But when we're all invited to be in the space and maybe not necessarily have an equal say in all things, but at least to be there to witness and there to have those conversations is like really big. And I think it really, it allows trust, which allows better work.
It's one of my favorite things to do because I just firmly believe the collective knowledge is always far greater than the individual, is to ask the room, do we like this? Do we believe this? Is any of this working? Because if I don't believe that my designers are in love with it, if I don't believe that the collaborators have ignition and agency, I don't know why I would prefer a patron or a public's first experiences versus a team of people to say, what do we all think about this? And to me, it's my Indigenous values to respect designers enough to say, you are equitably as important as the performers. The whole like, shh, the actors on stage is BS. It's colonial, hierarchical, racist bullshit. That if a designer is talking to me or two designers are talking, their time, their space, their artistry is worth the respect for the actors on stage to quiet it down for a minute, to let them speak, to be heard. And I am over shushing designers. Mm-hmm. It is one of them. It makes me as an Indigenous woman feel so fucking uncomfortable. I respect and appreciate them, and performers that I work with, I don't care if they don't respect the designers. I'm their advocate. I'm their champion. I will help them make sure they have enough time, that they're getting paid the wages that they need to. And that is my responsibility as a director. I don't accept anymore the deplorable way directors and this sector has treated designers. It's inexcusable, and I refuse it. It's over. Not in any room or space that I create. That is the heat I bring to my love for designers. Yes. Sam, you, I want to make space for you as we're kind of coming to a close here. We're still going to do the lightning round after this, the lightning round of weird, appropriative, traumatic, uncomfortable experiences we've been through. But Sam, I want to make space to you around your thoughts as a costume designer around how the public, how leaders, how practitioners can help support, engage with your work as an artist.
Well, first of all, I just wanted to really speak to the Kamloopa process again, and more to what you were saying. I think Kamloopa, again, has been unique in that, you know, with those few round table discussions in the beginning, and you know, making sure that we had a chance to all get to know each other. I hadn't really had an opportunity before to really presence myself in the room, because I'm so used to like just kind of flitting in and out and like asking a question, and like my world being in wardrobe and whatnot. Like I'm not used to being involved in that, in your room, or what I would say your room. And so that was so unique for me. And in terms of like, you know, asking things of companies, I would just say, you know, we just really need to acknowledge the time that it takes, that we can't, you know, again, it's all about building trust, and we can't do that work to the fullest extent if we don't have that. So, you know, time to go out and talk with the community that you're either talking about, or, you know, if you're on a traditional territory that the work hasn't specified or whatever, like you need time to go into that community. You need time to build trust with your performers, with your director and everything. You know, you need time to learn about the things that you're representing, traditional practices and whatnot. That's like the biggest thing that I would say I need.
Yeah.
You know, just that consideration, understanding, again, like tokenism, is this the only play in your season? Why have you chosen this particular play? What does that mean? Why, you know?
Stop it. Stop it.
It needs to be more than just this individual play. It takes if this is going to be your only play or whatever, you need to understand the process and the weight and the responsibility that you are bringing with that, you know, like you can't, I don't know, you just can't do it in one show, in one season. This needs to be ongoing. And because of our international relationships, because, you know, we have treaties that people need to be, you know, mindful that they are also part of, they are, you know, settlers are also treaty people. Like, you know, it's the work has to be met in the middle, and it can't just always be, you know, the labor of the Indigenous cast and crew and creatives. Like it needs to be met, I guess. So
thank you so much, Sam. And I echo all of that. And your thoughtful diligence and your advocacy work as not just a costume designer and artist, but a true champion for processes that are ethical and holding people accountable. I'm just so proud that I get to know you and get to work with you in this generation. Yo.
Yeah, just to sort of, as an actor, most of the shows that I've been in, I have not met the design team, or didn't know the design team very well.
What?
Yeah,
oh, that's like, true. As an actor, that's true.
As an actor, you don't get, you know, until I held my own spaces and being a part of Kamloopa, those are the only places where I've actually where we've sat down and been like, you know, outside of sometimes those opening days of like
donut
everyone
time?
Says their name, yeah, and then that's it, and then you never see them again. I'm like, who are you? Who is the lighting designer?
That's Jonathan. He'll be putting you in your thong this season.
Yeah, like, you know, and maybe like the only person that you get sort of to know is the costume designer, because they have to like measure you or whatever. But even then, like in bigger institutions, it's like a team full of people. They barely know, they don't, there's no time. You get in, they're measuring you, they're talking to each other, and then you're out of there. Like there's no interpersonal time, right? And so what's beautiful about these spaces and working with these designers is that we get to sit around and be like, where are you at today? Like, how are you? Like, you know, and I like having those relationships make all of us feel more comfortable for all of us to do the work that we need to do to tell the story, because each one of us are storytellers. The designers are just as much a storyteller as the performer, as the writer, as the director is. Like it's everybody coming together to tell this story.
Thank you so much, Yo-Yo. You know, I'll give, you know, let's do lightning rounds and then we'll do final thoughts. So like in 30 seconds or less, what has been a experience or process that either you got engaged with that you did, because I'm sorry, I am not perfect. I have failed, I have done or made inappropriate decisions around presenting and creating Indigenous theater, but what's one that's top of mind that you've been a part of where you're like, oh my God, I can't believe that. I can't believe I did that. While you're all thinking, I'll start. I was saying to Mishelle before, when I used to do film and TV auditions, I once was like, it was actually for Terrence Malick's The New World. I got 2 callbacks. I was at the Hyatt in downtown Vancouver, and they asked me to like frolic around the lobby something for an audition, because that was, you know, Malick is very cinematographic. And I was like, oh my God, I'm not native enough. I gotta like native up. So I like went to the mall and like went to like a fast fashion place and bought a like native looking dress and native shoes, walk to the SkyTrain, like I'm so mortified I did this. And that's not okay. Like not doing homework on a surface level, like that's not okay. So the other thing I will add is that I once was asked to hold like an African spear for an Indigenous fishing scene. So
what?
That was a bit of a uncomfortable conversation around why we can't be doing that. Anyone who wants to go next?
I let them put me in Walmart moccasins.
Ooh.
I was like, these aren't real moccasins. We don't have money for real moccasins. Okay.
Let's just put on some speakers then. You know what I mean? Okay, Emily, what about you?
Yeah, I was gonna say I worked on a super awful show when I mean, among many, when I was first starting out as a designer, and it was a historic piece, and I shouldn't have taken the contract. When I read the script, I was like, this is gonna be bad news. But also, when you're young and you're starting, and it's a contract. And it was the first part of a workshop. It was a historical piece that had centered around the Northwest Mounted Police, and then there was a few Indigenous characters that I was doing costumes when I still used to do that, and I was doing super neutral costumes for everyone because I was like, we don't have the budget, we don't have the time, we're not appropriating anything. Everyone gets like neutral kind of boring costumes because like we really can't do anything else, and it's better to be boring than it is to be racist, like when we come down to it.
Get that tattooed.
The day it's better to be boring than it is to be racist.
And the director kept being like, but could you like put some like feathers in their hair? And I was like, no. And they're like, could you do this? I'm like, no. And like I stood my ground, but I should have just fucking quit. Like worst, if I would like to like scrub all memory of that process.
Oh my gosh, Emily.
From my brain.
Thank you so much. Sam McCue, what's this something where you're like, oh?
It's not professionally, but certainly at school. So I went,
Oh no.
Did we lose there?
Oh,
The lightning also affected the internet.
Oh no.
Oh my gosh. While we're just waiting on Sam, Mishelle, why don't we go to you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have one particular like horrible cringy thing, but I have like stolen a lot of music. Like a lot of shows where they were like, it's fine. And I was like, I don't know, is it fine to like just take this, not pay for it? And they're like, it so can. And then as I like really very much learned that you cannot do that. And like, but for a while, because it would be the thing where they'll be like, well, why don't you just compose it? And I'd be like, I can't compose that in the amount of time that I have. So I guess we'll just like so much stolen music. And when I did go to acting school, I used to actually think that it was like, I was very lucky because I was ethnically ambiguous. So I could play any ethnicity.
The ethnically ambiguous auditions.
Yeah.
I got the same thing.
Yeah, and I was like, lucky me. Isn't that great for me?
Yeah.
Lucky me.
Also, SOCAN is like that magical word that people are like, oh, don't worry.
Here's a
SOCAN.
tip. Here's a tip for
But
producers.
what does it mean?
Here's a tip for playwrights. Don't write a play that needs a Madonna song. That is as hard to do as flying someone in from the sky. Also,
Okay, this is a really great point that I want to bring up that I don't think a lot of writers or creators understand. And where a lot of racist practice can't occur is when producers and writers don't understand what it takes to execute a show. And I think if there's one thing that we've talked about here, you know, as we kind of summarize our experiences, and Sam, I'll come to just after this, is the fact that one, the resources for anti-racist work is more, because of the racist practices and sector that we've inherited. And two, we as Indigenous creators working with non-Indigenous peoples have to be incredibly competent around what it takes to execute. My work to understand what it takes for Mishelle to do a sound, show, and piece has to be realistic. I have to be responsible about that. We can't set up, and I think this is where, Mishelle, you're talking about unreasonable expectations or ill-informed expectations of our teams. We have to understand that it's going to cost money, it's going to cost time, and if you don't show up to work prepared, there's really very little work that we can do. But before we completely close out, Sam, what was this your at-school theater piece? What happened? We're all dying to know.
Sorry, I have really bad internet, and it seems to hate when I start talking. But
it might be a white man. So, be careful.
It's a tiny white man.
It's a tiny white man controlling your internet. I swear, it must be.
But yes, at school we did a year studying colonialism and indigeneity, and I was super excited because I was like 19 and I was 19, 20 or whatever, and I was going to be head of wardrobe on one of these. It was a Daniel David Moses show. And yeah, he came to see it after. It was really great. But only one of the cast members out of like 14, I think, 14. It was a big cast. Only one of them was Indigenous. And at the time, I was just like, wow, I get to like have this, because at that point, I hadn't clocked that I could combine my Indigenous heritage and theater. At that point, that didn't occur to me. And so I was like super excited about the year. I was like, wow, this is great. You know, I'm looking into this, and now that I look back on it, I'm just like, okay, you know, like I'm glad like somebody was there, like in the room, and we had the set designer. He was Mohawk, but you know, nobody else, and we had an Indigenous director, Yvette Nolan. But I don't know, like if it's like that in our schools, then you know, we're gonna have issues.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
So thank you, Sam. And I think, you know, theater school is a whole other topic that we can talk about in terms of how we are failing young Indigenous people, Black people, and people of color in terms of entering the sector with any equity. But I think for me, what I kind of, just to summarize and what I've been hearing is around resources, thought, deep listening, preparedness, clear communication between arts leadership, grounding the work via, you know, I would say all of you do copious amounts of research and information before you even step into the room. And for me, I think, as speaking as a director and a writer, I think there has to be agency for me to curate and collaborate and create teams of international work that elevate BIPOC peoples, that elevate non-binary people, gender non-conforming, that elevate marginalized voices. And we're talking about appropriation. It's usually from the oppressed culture usurping more power from a marginalized culture. And so I'm very interested in this internation collaboration, especially as I work towards Break Horizons, where we have Indigenous women from 5 different Salish nations, 3 interior Salish and 1 coastal. But that for me, it takes a lot of research. I'm living on the land. I'm visiting those spaces. I'm meeting with elders. I'm hiring cultural consultants. I'm starting that process literally. It's going to be 4 years in advance before that show hits the deck. And that's the type of investment and relational work this Indigenous theater and non-appropriative anti-racist practice takes. If you're not investing in the community before you have to commodify these relationships because a show is happening, you're not doing the work in a way that has any integrity. If you're trying to parlay consultants who you're paying $150 an hour to be the Indigenous voice, to be the person of color voice for the entire show, you're not actually doing the work. And for me, what is parallel to the conversation of appropriative practice is the lack of preparedness, responsibility, and accountability that these institutions have to take with regards to resourcing and ethically creating relationships that protect the performers who are involved, so we don't have to worry about not having the time to do everything that you're saying. I think trying to shove Indigenous theater down an imperial or white model is white supremacy, is imperial supremacy. If you don't think you need Indigenous teams, if you don't think you need Indigenous consultants, if you haven't budgeted for all these things and done your capacity building as an organization to hold all of this work so the director isn't having to do all the work, so the writer, so the designers aren't, then you really have no business taking this on. And that doesn't mean you don't get to do, as Sam McCue said, 1 show a year. It means that you need to take the budget for the rest of your season and invest it in being not so racist and culturally competent to hold Indigenous, Black, POC shows, because what's happening right now is not good enough. This needs to be one of many other panels to talk about the lack of work, the lack of competency, the ignorance and racist practices that is currently are present. And I'm really having to battle against white supremacist structures and models that I've inherited. And what's to me equally as frightening is Indigenous, and this is a whole other issue, but I want to make a point around it, is Indigenous people, practitioners, and plays following imperial models that are traumatizing, that are not ethical, that haven't thought about what we're saying. Yolanda's talking about safety, that have a product-based deliverable and don't take accountability for the process being the art. And I think for me, if you take anything leaving this, it's about relationships. You know, I have every one of you on text. I have every one of you on WhatsApp. I attend your events. I understand what's going on in your life, because for me as a producer, as a director, that's my responsibility to ensure I can meet you. And I think Mishelle and Emily, I've really heard you saying that, meeting people in the moment, getting to that arrival. It's my due diligence to understand where designers are at, so I can make sure that I understand the space that I create for them is satisfactory for them to be excellent, compelling, and moving. And I don't think directors, and this is my little director rant, I don't think directors do enough advocacy work, responsibility work, and accountability work to ensure their designers are being given spaces, budget, and compensation that accurately reflects the work that they're doing. And directors not knowing what their designers are getting paid is white supremacist bullshit. You should know, and you can ask, are you getting paid enough? And if they're not, if you haven't helped them with negotiations, that's not good enough. It's not good enough. They shouldn't be siloed to have to champion for themselves and not understand it. As a director, as a creator, I know what I'm asking. And I want everyone to show up to work having enough money. And I say to my designers, and I said to Mishelle, I said, what gets you excited to come to work today? What's that number? And let's go get that number. And that is my job as an Indigenous producer and as an Indigenous director, that I hold to my designers, not just my performers, because that's what being a good Salish woman is for me. And I don't hear that enough. I hear designers being like, I don't know what to budget. I don't know what to do. That's horseshit. We're supposed to be artistic leaders here, assembling a team. You should know exactly what everyone's getting paid if they're consenting to that number. If nothing else, you should know I'm not getting paid enough, because if your designers aren't excited to come to work, the art will suffer. And that's just piss poor leadership to me. And that's the tea.
Yes. Yes, Kim.
Last words from anyone else before we round out this conversation. Mishelle.
Just gonna say that if anyone, I don't know who's watching this, but if anyone else there wants to talk through or needs help in figuring out who to talk to, I'm always happy to have those conversations. I think maybe just if you want to get in touch with any of us, you can go through the title block email, which is probably Michael can put in the chat. But like, you know, me and Emily have learned some and are continually learning. And if what you feel like you want to talk about is, you know, how do I be in the space? Like, you know, I'm happy to have those conversations and give you some perspectives of my experiences, or to help you find a person who might be the right person to talk to. So I think that, you know, we're real happy to have those conversations if you want them.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to also echo that I'm always open for conversations. I mean, just in general, I'm a conversational person, but also specifically about this. And yeah, just like say, yeah.
Thank you. And I think that's a part of too training non-Indigenous collaborators, is for you to hold space so that Yo-Yo, who's incredibly busy, and myself and Sam don't have to experience it and keep re-educating. A big part of the team members that I continually work with, like Mishelle, like Emily, like Daniela, like Sam, know that they now have this knowledge, and as a knowledge holder, it's their responsibility to share it. So please don't take their offers just as kind of performative. I know that they would actually be happy to have conversations with you, because that's what anti-racist equity, creating an Indigenous theater sector is going to take. So I think that's it for now. Michael, I'm going to throw it over to you.
Thank you. That was, I know I just sort of appeared out of nowhere.
Hello.
Thank you so much. That was an incredible discussion. I want to make sure that people know that they can go to thetitleBlock.com to find the show notes. This will be released on the podcast feed probably on the weekend, but maybe in a week from now. My life is a bit busy, but I will try to get this out. It's an important conversation. Please share it with your friends. The last Title Block Live that we had has been viewed over 300 times. It's been the most popular one we've had. And I think these kind of discussions are the one that we want to foster. on this channel, and that we need to. And while the title block certainly looks back at the history of theater on the north end of Turtle Island, we have to look forward as well. And one of the things that we talk about on the show a lot is the precarious nature of theater and theater creation. And it's a theme that runs through every single conversation I have with designers. And it is really exciting to know that people are trying to, not only in this ridiculous time of COVID-19, but in trying to figure out a different relationship between creators in order to create a new and vibrant and sustainable and interesting and important theater. So that's, I think that's really, I think it's optimistic. Even though at times I get very, I feel the darkness.
You don't quit theater 5 times a year like me? You have to quit theater 5 times a year, at least 4 with the seasons, because of how disappointing it is, Michael.
Oh, I know. Well, I mean, I left theater professionally 12 years ago, 14 years ago. So that probably says something. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. And thank you so much for your time. It's very generous. Thank you to the Associated Designers of Canada for helping support this kind of work. Please go to thetitleBlock.com. I've put the email in the chat, so if those on YouTube can get a hold of me, and I can put you in touch with anybody here on the panel. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time on the Title Block.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Jimmy Glitch.